Hi everybody, welcome back to our Jane Eyre read-along, and guess what? Today we are finishing Jane Eyre. We're reading the conclusion. I can't believe we've made it this far. I started reading this out loud on Facebook Live when we first went into quarantine, and I'm finishing it today, and we're still kind of in quarantine. But if you remember where we left off last week, Jane was with Rochester at Ferndean, and she agreed to marry him. So now we'll find out how that goes. And thanks so much for joining me today. Conclusion. Reader, I married him. A quiet wedding we had, he and I, the parson and clerk, were alone present. When we got back from church, I went into the kitchen of the manor house, where Mary was cooking the dinner and John cleaning the knives, and I said, "Mary, I have been married to Mr. Rochester this morning." The housekeeper and her husband were both of that decent, phlegmatic order of people to whom one may say at any time, safely communicate a remarkable piece of news without incurring the danger of having one's ears pierced by some shrill ejaculation and subsequently stunned by a torrent of wordy wonderment. Mary did look up, and she did stare at me. The ladle with which she was basting a pair of chickens roasting at the fire did for some 3 minutes hang suspended in air, and for the same space of time John's knives also had rest from the polishing process. But Mary, bending again over the roast, said only, "Have you, miss? Well, for sure." A short time after she pursued, "I seed you go out with the master, but I didn't know you were gone to church to be wed," and she basted away. John, when I turned to him, was grinning from ear to ear. "I telled Mary how it would be," he said. "I knew what Mr. Edward," John was an old servant, and had known his master when he was the cadet of the house, therefore he often gave him his Christian name. "I knew what Mr. Edward would do, and I was certain he would not wait long neither, and he's done right, for aught I know. I wish you joy, miss," and he politely pulled his forelock. "Thank you, John. Mr. Rochester told me to give you and Mary this." I put into his hand a 5-pound note. Without waiting to hear more, I left the kitchen, and passing the door of that sanctum some time after, I caught the words. So they type this out in vernacular, and I'm just going to read it plain because I really mess up when I try reading it in the vernacular. "She'll do better for him than any of the grand ladies. Even if she hadn't been one of the handsomest, she's very good nature, and she is fair beautiful. Anybody may see that." I, Jane, wrote to Morehouse and to Cambridge immediately to say what I had done, fully explaining also why I had thus acted. Diana and Mary approved the step unreservedly. Diana announced that she would give me just enough time to get over the honeymoon, and then she would come and see me. "She had better not wait till then, Jane," said Mr. Rochester when I read her letter to him. "If she does, she will be too late, for our honeymoon will shine our life long. Its beams will only fade over your grave or mine." How St. John received the news, I don't know. He never answered the letter in which I communicated it. Yet 6 months after, he wrote to me, without, however, mentioning Mr. Rochester's name or alluding to my marriage. His letter was then calm and, though very serious, kind. He has maintained a regular, though not frequent, correspondence ever since. He hopes I am happy, and trusts I am not of those who live without God in the world, and only mind earthly things. You have not quite forgotten little Adele, have you, reader? I had not. I soon asked and obtained leave of Mr. Rochester to go and see her at the school where he had placed her. Her frantic joy at beholding me again moved me much. She looked pale and thin. She said she was not happy. I found the rules of the establishment were too strict, its course of study too severe for a child of her age. I took her home with me. I meant to become her governess once more, but I soon found this impractical. My time and cares were now required by another. My husband needed them all. So I sought out a school conducted on a more indulgent system, and near enough to permit of my visiting her often, and bringing her home sometimes. I took care she should never want for anything that could contribute to her comfort. She soon settled in her new abode, became very happy there, and made fair progress in her studies. As she grew up, a sound English education corrected in a great measure her French defects. And when she left school, I found in her a pleasing and obliging companion, docile, good-tempered, and well-principled. By her grateful attention to me and mine, she has long since well repaid any little kindness I ever had it in my power to offer her. My tale draws to its close. One word respecting my experience of married life, and one brief glance at the fortunes of those whose names have most frequently recurred in this narrative, and I have done. I have now been married 10 years. I know what it is to live entirely for and with what I love best on earth. I hold myself supremely blessed beyond what language can express, because I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine. No woman was ever nearer to her mate than I am, ever more absolutely bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. I know no weariness of my Edward's society. He knows none of mine, any more than we do of the pulsation of the heart that beats in our separate bosoms. Consequently, we are ever together. To be together is for us to be at once as free as in solitude and as gay as in company. We talk, I believe, all day long. To talk to each other is but a more animated and audible thinking. All my confidence is bestowed on him. All his confidence is devoted to me. We are precisely suited in character. Perfect concord is the result. Mr. Rochester continued blind the first 2 years of our union. Perhaps it was that circumstance that drew us so very near, that knit us so very close. For I was then his vision, as I am still his right hand. Literally, I was, what he often called me, the apple of his eye. He saw nature, he saw books through me, and never did I weary of gazing for his behalf, and of putting into words the effect of field, tree, town, river, cloud, sunbeam, of the landscape before us, of the weather round us, and impressing by sound on his ear what light could no longer stamp on his eye. Never did I weary of reading to him, never did I weary of conducting him where he wished to go, of doing for him what he wished to be done. And there was a pleasure in my services, most full, most exquisite, even though sad, because he claimed these services without painful shame or damping humiliation. He loved me so truly that he knew no reluctance in profiting by my attendance. He felt I loved him so fondly, and that to yield that attendance was to indulge my sweetest wishes. One morning, at the end of the 2 years, I was writing a letter to his dictation. He came and bent over me and said, "Jane, have you a glittering ornament round your neck?" I had a gold watch chain. I answered, "Yes." "And have you a pale blue dress on?" I had. He informed me then that for some time he had fancied the obscurity clouding one eye was becoming less dense, and that now he was sure of it. He and I went up to London. He had the advice of an eminent oculist, and he eventually recovered the sight of that one eye. He cannot now see very distinctly. He cannot read or write much, but he can find his way without being led by the hand. The sky is no longer a blank to him, the earth no longer a void. When his firstborn was put into his arms, he could see that the boy had inherited his own eyes as they once were, large, brilliant, and black. On that occasion, he again, with a full heart, acknowledged that God had tempered judgment with mercy. My Edward and I, then, were happy, and the more so because those we love are happy likewise. Diana and Mary Rivers are both married. Alternately, once every year, they come to see us, and we go to see them. Diana's husband is a captain in the Navy, a gallant officer, and a good man. Mary's is a clergyman, a college friend of her brother's, and, from his attainments and principles, worthy of the connection. Both Captain Fitzjames and Mr. Wharton love their wives, and are loved by them. As to St. John Rivers, he left England. He went to India. He entered on the path he had marked for himself. He pursues it still. A more resolute, indefatigable pioneer never wrought amidst rocks and dangers. Firm, faithful, and devoted, full of energy and zeal and truth, he labors for his race. He clears their painful way. I'm losing the lights. He clears their painful way to improvement. He hews down like a giant the prejudices of creed and caste that encumber it. He may be stern, he may be exacting, he may be ambitious yet, but his is the sternness of the warrior Greatheart, who guards his pilgrim convoy from the onslaught of Apollyon. His is the exaction of the apostle, who speaks but for Christ when he says, "Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross and follow me." His is the ambition of the high master spirit, which aims to fill a place in the first rank of those who are redeemed from the earth, who stand without fault before the throne of God, who share the last mighty victories of the Lamb, who are called and chosen and faithful. St. John is unmarried. He never will marry now. Himself has hitherto sufficed to the toil, and the toil draws near its close. His glorious sun hastens to its setting. The last letter I received from him drew from my eyes human tears, and yet filled my heart with divine joy. He anticipated his sure reward, his incorruptible crown. I know that a stranger's hand will write to me next, to say that the good and faithful servant has been called at length into the joy of his Lord. And why weep for this? No fear of death will darken St. John's last hour. His mind will be unclouded, his heart will be undaunted, his hope will be sure, his faith steadfast. His own words are a pledge of this. My master, he says, has forewarned me. Daily he announces more distinctly, surely I come quickly, and hourly I more eagerly respond, Amen. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. And that is the end of Jane Eyre. Woo, we made it. So Jane marries Rochester. He gets some of his vision back. Her cousins, Diana and Mary, get married. St. John lives out his dream going to India and supposedly will die happy there. So everything's all wrapped up neatly, which is great. But I did want to mention, in case you don't know, there is a book called The Wide Sargasso Sea by Jane Eyre. So this book came out about 100 years after Jane Eyre was written. It came out in 1966, and it's considered a feminist anti-colonial response to Jane Eyre. So The Wide Sargasso Sea tells the story of the mad woman in the attic, of Rochester's first wife, Bertha, before she meets Rochester, and then when she meets Rochester and when he takes her over to England. So, did I say already it's feminist anti-colonial? A little bit about the book. It starts on a sugar plantation in Culebri, Jamaica, when Antoinette Causeway, which is Bertha's real name, her real name is Antoinette, is a child. Formerly wealthy, her mother's estate has become derelict, and her family has been plunged into poverty since the abolition of slavery. Antoinette's mother, Annette, marries a wealthy Englishman named Mr. Mason, that name sounds familiar, who is hoping to exploit his wife's situation. However, the freed slaves, they've been freed recently, are angry at the returning wealth of Annette, and so they burn down her house. So this sort of starts the theme of fire and houses burning that continues in Jane Eyre. So they burn down her house, and her disabled son is in the home. Annette's disabled son, who is also Antoinette's brother, he dies, Pierre. And when Pierre dies, Annette, who's already having like some mental trauma, just loses it from the grief of losing her son. And Mr. Mason sends her away to caretakers, and Antoinette never sees her again. So already Antoinette's having trouble. There's a lot of classism and racial inequities and anger towards both the, initially the slave owners, and then of course the slaves who are freed. They're upset with each other. So there's a lot of strife where she's growing up, and then this mental anguish of losing her brother, losing her mother, and then out of nowhere comes an unnamed Englishman. They never say it's Rochester, but you just sort of assume. And then Antoinette's nurse, Christophine, does not like the Englishman, and when they become married, which happens very quickly, he immediately becomes unfaithful and emotionally abusive to Antoinette. He's very disrespectful. He doesn't treat her well at all after they're married. So he starts calling her Bertha instead of her real name, Antoinette, and that's how we know her in Jane Eyre as Bertha. And Antoinette, of course, becomes paranoid about what's happening around her. She's disappointed in her marriage, and mentally and emotionally, this is makes her distraught. So at that point, she goes back to Christophine, her old nurse, and asks her for a Nobea potion to reignite her husband's love, which doesn't work. So there is a little bit of like voodoo in this story. And then when Antoinette is taken to England and put up in Thornfield Hall's attic, it's a very hard time for her. She doesn't understand what's going on, and she talks a lot about how it's cold there, not just environmentally, because of course England is colder than Jamaica, but just like the people are cold, the atmosphere is cold, because she grew up on the ocean and it was very warm. Structurally, the buildings are different to her and seem more cold and intimidating, and the mannerisms of the people are also colder than she is used to. So she's brought into a strange environment, and her husband locks her in the attic, doesn't use her real name. So you should read this. It's very beautifully written, it's haunting, but it's very sad. Don't read this if you don't think you can take a sad book, but I think this is a great addition to the Jane Eyre story. Of course, it's just mostly about Rochester and Bertha, or Antoinette, but I think it's important. It did not change my opinion of Rochester in Jane Eyre, because obviously it's two different authors, two different time periods, but it does give you an interesting perspective on his first wife, the mad woman in the attic. So you should definitely check this out if you're a Jane Eyre fan. It's really good. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this whole time. We made it to the end of Jane Eyre. If you want to read it on your own later, you can always get it on Overdrive or Libby on your phone or device. You can also get it from free sites like Google Books or archive.org. And then if you want even more of the story, check out The Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Riss. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this long reading of Jane Eyre, and I'll see you next time, whenever that might be.